Says Michael Popak, Legal AF. September just got very busy for a defendant named Donald Trump, both criminally and civilly. Just 3 days apart after Labor Day, Donald Trump is going to have to first argue his oral argument on the appeal of the jury verdict against him in the E. Jean Carroll case, in which the New York jury of a federal jury found that he sexually assaulted E. Jean Carroll and that he defamed her as a result. Now, that's the $5.5 million judgment. For those that are kind of late to the story, a year later, the second E. Jean Carroll case for being defamed again and punitive damages, that's where she got a huge over $100 million judgment. But at core is the same appellate issue that Donald Trump has raised. And now the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the highest level court in New York, is going to be hearing oral argument on the fundamental issue of whether as a matter of law or otherwise, the jury should have found that he sexually abused and assaulted E. Jean Carroll based on instructions given by Judge Lewis Kaplan. And that's going to be on the 6th of September, 2024 in the case. That is just a few days before, in the state court of New York, presided over in the Supreme Court by Judge Juan Merchan, he and his lawyers, Donald Trump, are going to be heading in for sentencing related to the 34 felony counts that Donald Trump was convicted of by a state court jury of 12 people just a couple of months ago for business record fraud in furtherance of a second crime involving election fraud or Internal Revenue Service business deduction fraud. So it's all coming together. Now, I've seen some MAGA, some Trumpers say, oh, how convenient, tie him up in court in and around the same days instead of doing something else, like, I don't know, campaigning. But again, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime. It's not the criminal and civil justice's fault that things are landing on a calendar that also maps onto a political calendar. It's not as if the Second Circuit, in scheduling the appeal, looked at the calendar and said, let's do maximum damage and schedule it for September. I mean, Donald Trump has been a candidate for office to try to save his hide and stop him from being criminally prosecuted for over 2 years. So unless your argument is, which apparently the Trumpers' argument is, he should never have to answer for any of the judgments that have been rendered against him civilly, and he shouldn't be sentenced for the crimes he committed before he ran for office, before he was even a President Trump. Unless that's your argument, then what's the justice system to do but schedule whenever they can, just like he's any other ordinary criminal or sex offender? That's all that we're watching here. That's all that I see. And yes, they're 3 days apart or so. September 6th for the Second Circuit argument, September 9th for the sentencing, or 7th for the sentencing in front of Judge Merchan. But who cares? Donald Trump is doing everything he can and has done everything he can to throw sand in the gears of justice and have delay. Many of these issues would have been resolved much earlier. Judge Merchan, the only reason the sentencing is happening in September for the 34 felony count conviction and not a month and a half ago is because Donald Trump asked for additional time. He said, I want to brief the immunity issue. Now that the Supreme Court has ruled on July 1, Judge, we want to brief why the immunity issue gives me immunity related to things that happened before I was even president. And a couple of checks I wrote while I was president for the private affair and the private cover-up. And the judge says, well, I don't really see that. This is my paraphrase, but let's brief it. And I'll postpone the sentencing to accommodate your briefing, Mr. Trump, on immunity. That's why that ended up in September. And the Second Circuit moves at its own pace. I've argued plenty of cases in front of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and they schedule, once briefing is done and the record is done, they schedule when they can. And there's a lot of downtime in the summers for judges. They go to conferences and they take vacations. Not a lot happens in courtrooms in August. I'll just be frank with you. And things get pushed off into the very first week after Labor Day. It happens in every one of my cases. It's hurry up and wait. It's wait and hurry up the other way around. And so that's all we're saying. So there's no nefarious plot against Donald Trump that all of these dates are landing at the same time while he would rather be doing a rally indoor or outdoor to try to get elected. None of that is happening. So look, at the end of the day, the big news here for the hot take is we got a date. And it's going to be a very busy week around Legal AF right after Labor Day, because we're going to be following the oral argument at the Second Circuit, which is usually done in a way, in audio recorded, that we're able to report on. And I'm sure we'll get it up on the MeidasTouch network for oral argument for that. Just to be clear, full briefing happens. There's 3 total briefs in an appeal. The appellant, which is in this case Donald Trump, the one bringing the appeal. The appellee, which in this case is E. Jean Carroll. The appellant gets 2 briefs, the first and the last, and the appellee gets a middle brief. And then there's an oral argument if the appellate court wants oral argument, and they usually do. And the oral argument is usually live and in person, and there's a panel. It's usually a 3-judge panel that's picked from the entirety of the circuit that's involved, in this case, the Second Circuit. There's a chief judge. The most senior judge is usually, status-wise, is usually the chief judge presiding over that oral argument. And then you're given usually 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, longer if the panel finds the arguments interested. I mean, I've argued many appeals where I only had on paper 10 minutes that went over an hour. It really just depends. You know, they run their own docket, and they decide when the red light and the green light for the oral advocates is going to go on. And even when the red light goes on, they can say, well, you know, we want to follow up on a couple of questions by other people up here on the panel. And then from there, it could be anywhere from 1 to 6 months or more before the panel rules on it. And on a civil case involving money, I think that they're not going to be, rushing around on this. And for those that are worried about E. Jean Carroll, the judgment runs with interest, both the $5.5 million and the $83 million that she was awarded by 2 separate juries. The appeal involves liability issues that involve both. And so ultimately, he had to post bonds. He had to post a surety bond with a bonding company. I think the $5.5 million, Donald Trump put up cash. So there's a cash deposited with the clerk of the court running with interest, and there's $100 million or a bond sufficient to cover the $83.5 million judgment with interest. And then if he loses the appeal, let's say in early 2025, judgment's due, and they can go right. E. Jean Carroll, if she wins, can go right to the bonding company and to the clerk and say, money, please. Give me the money. She doesn't have to go chase assets. She doesn't have to try to foreclose on property. She doesn't have to lien or levy against Donald Trump or his assets or his money. She's got the bonds. That's the beauty of the bonds. And that's why courts say, if you want to stop the enforcement of your judgment that's being held by the plaintiff, E. Jean Carroll, you got to post what's called a supersedious or appeal bond. And that's what Donald Trump did, cash in for the smaller amount. And he got a fanboy who owned a surety company to post the other bond for him. And that's where we're at, related to all of those things. So I'm going to continue to follow what happens because there are still many, many civil and criminal cases against Donald Trump with developments. We follow it all at the intersection of law and politics on Legal AF. And you know where to find that. MeidasTouch YouTube channel, and on Legal AF, the podcast, on all platforms. Wednesdays, Saturdays, 8 p.m. Eastern time. And then I do hot takes like this about every hour, well, at least every day on the MeidasTouch network. So until my next hot take, until my next Legal AF, this is Michael Popak reporting. Heary, heary, Legal AF Law Breakdown is now in session. Go beyond the headlines and get a deep dive into the important legal concepts you need to know, and we discuss every day on Legal AF. Exclusive content you won't find anywhere else, all for the price of a couple of cups of coffee. Join us at patreon.com/legalaf. That's patreon.com/legalaf.